On April 26, 1988, Valery Legasov records tapes in which he assigns blame to engineer Anatoly Dyatlov and other higher-ups for the Chernobyl disaster. He discloses the truth about the events that transpired on that fateful night. Legasov successfully conceals the tapes while evading the notice of a mysterious man in a car. Subsequently, he returns to his apartment and takes his own life. His death occurred the day after the second anniversary in real life. Flashback to 2 years earlier. Reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant erupts near Pripyat, Ukraine. Firefighter Vasily Ignatenko and his pregnant wife, Lyudmila Ignatenko, witness the explosion from their apartment. Vasily is later summoned to combat the ensuing fire. Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov refuses to accept that the core has exploded, dismissing the claims made by some of the workers. Dyatlov leaves the plant to meet with the Pripyat Executive Committee, accompanied by Chernobyl manager Viktor Bryukhanov and Chief Engineer Nikolai Fomin. They conclude that a hydrogen explosion caused a leakage of contaminated water, downplaying the dangers and prohibiting the evacuation of residents. They also cut off all communication to the outside world. Due to the core's exposure and the dispersion of several blocks of nuclear graphite around the plant, numerous workers and firefighters, including a suspicious Vasily, start experiencing acute radiation syndrome. Lyudmila, concerned about the explosion's risks, refuses to join her neighbors at the road bridge to observe the fire, inadvertently subjecting them to high radiation doses. In an attempt to mitigate the damage, Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptanov manually open the water valves to flood the damaged reactor and restore cooling, but this exposes them to lethal radiation doses. Chernobyl's deputy chief operational engineer, Anatoly Sitnikov, reports the exposed core to the committee after observing graphite blocks on the ground. Despite initial dismissals, Bryukhanov and Fomin compel Sitnikov to inspect the roof visually after Dyatlov collapses from ARS, leading to Sitnikov's radiation exposure. Legasov receives a call from the Council of Ministers Deputy Chairman Boris Sherbina, instructing him to provide technical advice to the response committee. Meanwhile, in Pripyat, the radioactive smoke from the explosion's fire drifts slowly towards the town, causing a starling to fall from the sky and perish due to radiation, unbeknownst to the oblivious citizens. 7 hours following the incident, Ulana Komyuk and her colleague detect an increase in radiation levels in Minsk, Belarus, as a radiation detector registers elevated levels of iodine-131. This strongly indicates uranium-235, a rare isotope primarily used as reactor fuel, as the likely source. After conducting tests, they swiftly deduce that the Ignalina nuclear plant is the most probable site for the incident, dismissing Chernobyl due to its considerable distance of over 400 kilometers. Komyuk notes that news of a catastrophic event at Chernobyl should have preceded the radiation reaching Minsk, signaling the urgency of the situation. Upon confirming no incident at Ignalina, Komyuk fails to reach Chernobyl's staff, leading her to the realization that the radiation source emanates from there. In an attempt to gather more information, she meets with the Minsk Executive Committee, only to be told that the situation is under control. Frustrated by the lack of attention to her concerns, Komyuk decides to head to Chernobyl alone, providing the committee's receptionist with iodine-131 counteractive pills and advising her to move far away from the city. In Chernobyl, the hospital is overwhelmed with citizens suffering from acute radiation syndrome, ARS, including Vasily Ignatenko, Alexander Akimov, and Leonid Toptanov. Lyudmila Ignatenko manages to bypass hospital security, learning that her husband has been transferred to another hospital in Moscow along with other ARS patients. In Moscow, Valery Legasov becomes alarmed after reading a report detailing events post-explosion. Initially downplaying the severity of the explosion during a committee meeting, members believe it to be a minor incident, citing a seemingly non-dangerous radiation level of 3.6 Röntgen. Legasov, however, points out flaws in the report, suggesting higher radiation levels if the core is exposed. Convinced of Legasov's expertise, Mikhail Gorbachev sends him, along with skeptical Boris Sherbina, to investigate Chernobyl. During their helicopter journey, Legasov realizes the core is exposed, convincing Sherbina of the danger. Confronting plant officials Bryukhanov and Fomin, Legasov's claims are met with accusations of misinformation. General Vladimir Pikolov measures the radiation, revealing it to be 15,000 Roentgens, leading to the arrest of Bryukhanov and Fomin. Legasov proposes extinguishing the fire with sand and boron, and a helicopter mission is launched, but one crashes, forcing an abort. Concerned about the lack of evacuation, Legasov informs Sherbina that they are still absorbing radiation, predicting their death within 5 years. After radiation is detected in Sweden, Pripyat is finally evacuated. Komyuk arrives at Chernobyl, informing Legasov and Shcherbina of the risk of a steam explosion. Legasov proposes a plan to drain the water from the basement, but it requires sending workers into the highly contaminated area. Gorbachev grants permission, and Legasov, Shcherbina, and Komyuk return to Chernobyl.
Plant workers Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov volunteered to locate and turn the sluice gate valve to pump water from some of the nuclear plant's tanks. Now they are sloshing through darkened waters, dosimeters clicking and using less than trustworthy flashlights. Thankfully, they managed to turn the valve, but the crisis is not over. In fact, part of the problem is whether Russians can adequately address the problem. When Lyudmila Ignatenko shows up to see her firefighter husband Vasily, she gets a pass after bribing the desk person. Then, when she meets him, she does not receive proper protection. Meanwhile, Soviet nuclear strategist Valery Legasov is critical of evacuation procedure. Due to a spike in zirconium-95, meltdown has begun, which means things are getting worse. Soon, Council of Ministers Deputy Chairman Boris Shcherbina calls Mikhail Gorbachev. Unfortunately, the news isn't good. The situation in the core is deteriorating, and a full meltdown would ruin the Pripyat River. The solution? They must get all liquid nitrogen in the Soviet Union. Shortly after that, Shcherbina takes a walk with Legasov. At first, it seems like an argument will ensue, but Shcherbina shows his human side, asking Legasov what will happen to those exposed to radiation. Legasov says it tears our cellular structures apart. Even after it seems some may recover, the damage can manifest later. Bone marrow dies. There will be organ and tissue decomposition, and arteries and veins spill open like sieves. Indeed, Chernobyl gives a good glimpse into what this looks and feels like, and it isn't pretty. Two things also become clear. Legasov and Shcherbina may themselves get cancer or other fatal effects, and that they are being watched by the government. Legasov meets with Ulana Komyuk. Like others, she questions that the core explosion was even possible. In her quest for truth, Komyuk first meets the hospitalized Chernobyl engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, who refuses to talk. Meanwhile, coal minister Mikhail Shchedov meets with Andrei Glukov, a mining crew chief. At first, Glukov resists his marching orders, saying, "We don't leave unless we know why." They're told about their need to prevent disastrous pollution of the Pripyat River. The miners agree to the mission, but all pat Shchedov's suit as they walk past, dirtying it with coal. Their task is to help install a liquid nitrogen heat exchanger underneath a concrete pad. It must be accessible from underground. If that's not enough, they can't use heavy machinery and must dig by hand. Given the limited time they have, Glukov wisely insists they begin immediately. It's pretty hellish digging in the mines, especially when officials deny Glukov's request for fans. Eventually, miners work with little to no clothing just to avoid the heat. Komyuk next talks to senior engineer Toptunov, whose nose bleeds as he speaks. She asks him why there wasn't an emergency shutdown immediately after disaster struck. Toptunov insists that they did press the emergency button, as does supervisor Alexander Akimov. After done questioning these two, she is arrested after threatening to publicize that Mrs. Ignatenko, who is pregnant, was in the hospital with no protective gear. In another meeting, Legasov details problems of radioactive debris and how evacuation needs to occur. Also, because everything will have radionuclides, they will have to kill many animals, raise forests, and build a containment structure around the exposed core itself. He emphasizes that thousands will die. Shortly after this, Legasov confronts KGB chairman Viktor Charkov about Komyuk's arrest. Charkov agrees to free her, emphasizing the Russian philosophy of trust but verify. Komyuk herself verifies that Toptunov and Akimov did everything right, so the mystery remains. What caused the Chernobyl core explosion? Meanwhile, as the miners dig, Mrs. Ignatenko attends her husband's funeral, where his lead coffin is buried under cement in a mass grave of other first responders. August 1986. The evacuation of the area around Chernobyl is well underway, though an elderly woman who is in the middle of milking her cow isn't too bothered about this. She explains at length to a soldier how she's lived there all her life, experienced war and all its associated horrors, and certainly isn't going to leave because of something she can't see. The soldier responds by simply shooting the cow and physically removing the woman. In Kyiv, a now visibly pregnant Lyudmila is shown into the apartment where she will now live alone, at least until she gives birth. Legasov and Shcherbina are briefing General Tarakhanov on the task facing them when it comes to building a protective cover over the ruins of Reactor 4. They explain that there are 3 zones on the reactor building's roof which need to be cleared of debris. Katya, with radiation levels of 1,000 Röntgen, fatal within 2 hours, even to a fully protected person. Nina, with 2,000 Röntgen, fatal within 1 hour. And Masha, with 12,000 Röntgen, fatal within 3 minutes, making it possibly the most dangerous place on Earth. For the task of clearing Katya and Nina, they have pulled the lunar rovers from the Soviet Union's abortive moon landing program out of storage and are retrofitting them into small, lightweight bulldozers. However, even the rovers cannot survive the radiation levels on Masha, and neither can any other technology the Soviets have to hand. It's therefore up to Tarakhanov to find a solution. A young man named Pavel has been conscripted to join the 250,000-strong army of liquidators and is driven to an encampment near the plant, where he's teamed up with 2 veterans of the Afghanistan War, Bacho and Garo. In between chugging down copious amounts of vodka, the 2 veterans realize just how desperate the situation is becoming if they're now recruiting non-military personnel. They then inform Pavel that they're on animal control duty and are in charge of euthanizing the animals in the exclusion zone, most of whom will be pets. Despite their fears, the adapted lunar rovers turn out to be quite capable of working in the radioactive environments of Katya and Nina. Masha remains a problem, but General Tarakhanov tells Legasov and Sherbina that they may have a solution in the form of a German bomb disposal robot. Only fly in the ointment is that it's a West German robot, which the trio note will likely force the Central Committee to acknowledge the full extent of the disaster during their negotiations to obtain it. Komyuk tries digging for the technical specifications of the RBMK design and asks for close to a dozen books, manuals, and research papers, and is only given one heavily redacted paper, fueling her suspicions that the state is trying to hide something. She drops in to see a recovering Dyatlov again, and he proves to be still in denial to the point of refusing to even acknowledge the reactor exploded until she shows him a photograph of the destroyed reactor building. Komyuk reveals that the state forgot to redact the table of contents in the paper she was given, and that the contents imply an issue caused by the AZ5 button and a positive void coefficient. Dyatlov confesses to having no idea what would have gone there and tells Komyuk that she's wasting her time. Regardless of what caused the accident, the end outcome will be the state suppressing the truth and a kangaroo court that will most likely lead to his execution. Komyuk leaves, still not much the wiser, but now knowing that if there was a fault in the reactor, even a man as experienced as Dyatlov was unaware of it. As Pavel, Bacho, and Garo are transported to a cleanup site, on arrival at the deserted village, Bacho instructs Pavel on gun safety and warns him not to let animals suffer. If the first bullet doesn't do the job by itself, he's to finish them off as quickly as possible. They begin doing their grim task and split up, with Pavel soon coming across a dog. He tries to shoo it away, but it walks towards him, happy to see a human for the first time in months. Nervously, he pulls the trigger, but his aim is too unsteady to one-hit kill it, leaving it grievously wounded but still alive. The sight of the wounded dog causes him to completely freeze up, forcing Bacho to finish it off and admonish him for letting it suffer, albeit not unsympathetically. When the trio break for lunch, Bacho tells Pavel of his first kill, making the point that while his young colleague's first kill may have been a dog, both his and Garo's first kills were humans. As Bacho takes a moment to reflect on the nature of killing and the toll it takes on someone's psyche, and Pavel sits in silent shell shock at the task remaining before him, Garo sums up the purpose of what they're doing by quoting the words on a tattered propaganda banner hung behind them. "Our goal is the happiness of all mankind." The 3 men contemplate this for a moment before Bacho shrugs it off and slings his gun over his shoulder again, telling the other 2 it's time to get back to work. September 1986. The cleanup operation is going well so far, with a good chunk of Katya and Nina now cleared. The bomb disposal robot Joker arrives and is airlifted onto Masha, and the reward for the month-long negotiations and eating crow among the international community is Joker's electronics completely burning up within approximately 10 seconds. Sherbina calls the Central Committee and completely loses it on finding out that they told West Germany the propaganda figure of 2,000 Roentgen, 6 times lower than the actual figure, was the highest anyone had detected, royally chewing out the committee members and destroying the telephone. With robots out of the question, they discuss other options that night. Sherbina suggests they drop molten lead from helicopters in order to coat the debris, but Tarakanov points out that not only would this be incredibly dangerous, the lead would make the helicopters too heavy to fly. Tarakanov, in turn, suggests shooting the debris off the roof with explosive bullets, and Sherbina retorts that they just set the roof back on fire. Legasov determines that their only remaining option is bio-robots. People, in other words. Pavel sweeps another village, thinking there's no way his job can possibly go from bad to worse, and is quickly proven wrong when he comes across a dog with a litter of puppies. Bacho quickly realizes that even he can't ask Pavel to do this and sends him out of the building while he does what needs to be done. Pavel walks away from the building with a blank expression as a series of gunshots and yelps ring out from within. Afterwards, the trio dig a pit in which they dump a small mountain of dead animals, which is covered over in concrete. October 1986. General Tarakanov instructs his latest squad of bio-robots on the immensely dangerous task facing them. They are to go to the roof of Reactor 4, where they will have a mere 90 seconds to scoop up and throw as much debris into the reactor core as possible. We then follow one of the squad members, whose face we never see, as he struggles to scoop up the heavy and potentially lethal debris in his shovel. After the 90 seconds are up, he gets his foot wedged under a large piece of graphite and struggles to get it out, spending around 20 more seconds on the roof than he was supposed to. Making matters worse, when he gets back inside, he discovers a tear in his protective boot. "Comrade soldier, you're done," calls out the attending officer, in context telling him to get to the decontamination area, but also hinting that he can at best expect to have decades shaved off his life and at worst will be dead within weeks. December 1986. Lyudmila is sat in a park near her Kyiv apartment when she feels a contraction. Before she can get help, she doubles over in pain and collapses, indicating that something is very wrong. In an abandoned schoolhouse in Pripyat, Legasov, Sherbina, and Komyuk meet up to secretly discuss Legasov's impending speech to an international conference in Vienna. Komyuk reveals that the Chernobyl plant management committed severe breaches of safety regulations, which likely contributed to the explosion, but that she still isn't entirely sure of its cause, only suspecting that some flaw with the AZ-5 button was a contributing factor. Legasov finally admits that he knew all along of the flaw in question, which is that when AZ-5 is pressed, the graphite tips of the control rods are the first things to enter the core, which briefly accelerates the reaction before the boron in the rods halts it. However, the only situation where that would become a severe problem would be if the reactor was already on the brink of a meltdown, meaning that Dyatlov's actions were indeed the principal cause of the disaster, albeit he had no way of knowing how bad it would be. However, the actual truth doesn't matter. Legasov has already been briefed that his job is to blame the disaster on Dyatlov, Bryukhanov, and Fomin, setting the stage for their eventual show trial. Komyuk demands that Legasov tell the full truth, which will force the government to repair the remaining RBMK reactors and ensure the same accident can't happen again elsewhere. But Sherbina reminds her that the KGB would exact revenge on Legasov, his family, and his friends, themselves included. Still, Komyuk pleads with Legasov to tell the truth, revealing that Lyudmila's daughter died only a few hours after birth, having absorbed a lethal dose of radiation in the womb, and asking Legasov whether it's worth lying to protect a country that allows such things to happen. Nearby, the final squadron of bio-robots has cleared the last of the debris from the roof, and all are awarded with commendations and a cash reward by General Tarakanov. From the nearby encampment, an already much more jaded Pavel puffs silently on a cigarette. In a maternity ward in Kyiv, several new mothers are cradling their babies. In the corner of the room, Lyudmila sits on her bed next to an empty crib, looking utterly broken. 25 April 1986. In Bryukhanov's office, Fomin confides in Dyatlov that their boss is in line for a big promotion, which will likely lead to them, in turn, getting promotions, just so long as Dyatlov successfully completes the safety test scheduled for that afternoon. An irate Bryukhanov then arrives in the office and complains that the grid controller in Kyiv has forbidden Reactor 4 from being fully reduced to the 700 megawatts power level required for the test until the end of the day, in order to ensure that monthly productivity quotas are met. Fomin reassures him that it's not a problem, and that they can keep the reactor at half power, 1,600 megawatts, until that night. Dyatlov leaves to get some sleep ahead of the now rescheduled test, while Bryukhanov excuses himself, leaving Fomin to admire the office he believes will soon be his. March 1987. As he buys a pack of cigarettes, Legasov, whose health is already starting to visibly deteriorate, is called into a nearby car. Its occupant turns out to be Charkov, who congratulates him on his recent speech to Vienna and tells him that Gorbachev intends to reward him with the Soviet Union's highest honor, the Hero of the Soviet Union, on the condition that he maintains the narrative that the accident was purely the fault of Dyatlov, Bryukhanov, and Fomin at their upcoming trial. After Legasov returns home, he's visited by Komyuk, who reveals that several members of the Soviet scientific community will be present at the trial and demands that Legasov lay clear the full extent of the flaws in the RBMK design. Legasov is conflicted, sure that there will be dire consequences if he does so, but also having gotten no reassurances from Charkov in their meeting that anything would be done to fix the remaining reactors, on top of knowing that he won't live long enough to enjoy his new honor for more than a few years. July 1987. The trial of Anatoly Dyatlov, Viktor Bryukhanov, and Nikolai Fomin is convened in the abandoned town of Chernobyl. Sherbina is first to give testimony, and he explains the need for the safety test that was carried out on that fateful night 15 months prior. The RBMK reactor is dependent on external power to run its cooling systems, and in the event of the power failing, it would take a minute for the backup power generators to fully kick in, potentially leading to a meltdown. To prevent this, the operators are supposed to divert power from the turbine to run the cooling systems until the backup generators can kick in, and this test has to be completed before the reactor can go online. Bryukhanov, Dyatlov, and Fomin, in fact, never carried out the test before the reactor went online in 1983, but falsely claimed that they had, so that they could get state honors and cash bonuses. The 3 times they tried it all ended in failure, and the 4th time, they successfully blew the reactor itself. Komyak then takes over the testimony and reveals that the test was meant to take place during the afternoon of April 25th and should have been scrapped entirely when the grid controller refused to allow it to take place as planned, but that the management decided to instead hold it that night. This resulted in the day shift, who had been trained to carry out the test, being replaced by the night shift. April 1986. Toptunov arrives for his usual night shift at Reactor 4 and is quickly called into the control room, where Akimov briefs him on the test that's meant to be taking place. However, the 2 men are confused by the instructions, half of which are crossed out. Akimov calls the staff in Reactor 3, who advise him to still follow the crossed-out instructions. Dyatlov then arrives and, after taking a moment to chew out turbine engineer Igor Kirschenbaum for not having read up on a test he wasn't expecting to carry out until moments beforehand, instructs Toptunov to bring the reactor down to the required 700 megawatts. Komyuk likens the situation that Toptunov, who was mere 25 years of age and only had 4 months of experience as the senior reactor control chief engineer at Chernobyl nuclear power plant, was forced to undertake this mission into space with minimal training, no prior warning, and only a list of half-crossed-out instructions to guide him. She adds that the bigger consequence of the delay was a poison building up in the reactor core. Legasov is next to testify and explains how the reactor works under normal conditions. As uranium atoms split apart and collide in a nuclear reactor, the reactivity goes up, and if left unattended, it never stops rising. So boron control rods are used to reduce the reactivity, just like brakes are used to stop a car. The reactor is water-cooled. As water takes away the heat from reactor, it is turned into steam, which again increases the reactivity, and heat, which means more steam, making it into a vicious cycle. But there is also negative temperature coefficient, which simply means that nuclear fuel is less reactive in more heat. Hence, it balances the cycle, generating 10% of Ukraine's power without smoke and flame. As uranium splits apart, it gives a byproduct as xenon, which reduces the reactivity, but it is not part of this cycle because it burns away at high temperatures. But since Dyatlov forcefully continued the test with the reactor running at 1600 megawatts for more than 10 hours, it remained in the reactor as a poison. In the control room that night, Toptunov is bringing the power down to the required 700 megawatts, at a slower pace than Dyatlov would like, when the power level suddenly drops to 500 megawatts, without any warning, despite Toptunov not operating the control rods at that moment. Akimov realizes that the core is being poisoned by a xenon buildup, and requests Dyatlov's permission to disable the reactor's automatic regulation systems for long enough to bring it back up to power. Dyatlov agrees, but when Akimov and Toptunov disable the automatic system, it has the opposite effect of what was intended and causes the power to completely crater, ending up at just 30 megawatts. Dyatlov is absolutely infuriated, and despite Akimov's pleading that the safety regulations require a complete shutdown and 24-hour wait for the xenon to decay away, Dyatlov orders him to get the power back to 700 megawatts by any means necessary, threatening to have them reassigned to Antarctica if they fail. Dyatlov suddenly interrupts Legasov's testimony to claim that he wasn't in the control room at that time, and that Akimov and Toptunov started raising the power of their own accord. This only serves to irk the prosecutor, Stepashin, who points out that both of the deceased men testified to the contrary. Sherbina then suffers a coughing fit, and the presiding judge decides that this is as good of a time as any for a recess. Outside, Sherbina fills in Legasov on the history of the town of Chernobyl, noting that its population was previously all but wiped out during World War II, but that people came back to live in the town anyway, until their blundering around with atomic energy rendered the town permanently uninhabitable. Sherbina then confides in Legasov that his own health situation is similarly grim, if not more so, and that he'll be lucky to be alive by the end of the following year. Succumbing to despair, Sherbina laments that his life and career never amounted to much, but Legasov reassures him that this is not true. Everything that was needed to contain the disaster was obtained through Sherbina, meaning that he saved far more lives than either one of them will ever know. When the proceedings resume, Legasov tells the court that the xenon levels in the reactor core were too strong for there to be any easy, let alone safe way of raising the power level. The only thing that Akimov and Toptunov could do was start removing the control rods, ultimately leading to them removing 205 out of 201 control rods, keeping only 6 inside the core. Despite their best efforts, Akimov and Toptunov can only get the reactor up to 200 megawatts. Dyatlov figures this is good enough, despite it being less than a third of what the test requires, and Akimov's protests that the steam levels and turbine speed are both too low for the test to deliver any valid results. By now, Stolyarchuk and Kirschenbaum are similarly convinced that what they're doing is extremely dangerous, but Dyatlov doesn't want to know and orders them to get things ready for the test. The reactor's Scala monitoring system prints out a report warning them that too few control rods are in the reactor and that they should shut down immediately, which is similarly blown off by Dyatlov. Finally, Dyatlov orders the test to begin, shutting off the supply of fresh cooling water. The remaining water begins to boil, at which point the reactor's heat goes up, burning up the xenon which had been slowing down the reaction and causing the reactor's power to spike 5-fold within a matter of seconds. Legasov says that Dyatlov broke every rule in the book and pushed Reactor 4 to the point of self-destruction, but that he did so under the belief that the AZ-5 button would prevent the disaster. Unbeknownst to him and the reactor's operators, that there was a fatal flaw in the system, namely the graphite tips of the control rods. Graphite increases the reactivity, and it's the first thing that enters in the core when the boron rods are pushed inside, which accelerate the reaction before it's stopped. Upon being asked why the control rods were designed this way, Legasov bluntly responds that it's for the same reason the Soviet Union is the only country to build and operate a reactor as poorly designed and lethally dangerous as the RBMK. It's cheaper. The court attendees are simultaneously irked by this insult to their national pride and alarmed at the implications of exactly what unfolded that night. Akimov reacts to the power spike by hitting the AZ-5 button, beginning the insertion of all the control rods into the reactor. The already accelerated reaction rate further increases, instantly vaporizing all the cooling water in the reactor. The increase in steam pressure damages the fuel rod mechanism and locks the graphite tips in place, which combine with heat, begin a colossal chain reaction, ripping the fuel channels apart, releasing more energy and increasing the steam pressure to unimaginable levels. Perevoshenko, in the reactor hall, sees the fuel caps, which weighs 240 kilograms each, jumping up and down, and flees in a fruitless attempt to warn the control room of the impending disaster. Kodymchuk and Degtyarenko watch as the pumps begin to burst open from the overpressure, but have no chance of avoiding the blast that will imminently claim both their lives. The control room staffers, meanwhile, watch in astonishment as the power spikes to 33,000 megawatts, over 10 times what it was designed to operate at, and likely a mere fraction of the actual power output. Finally, the steam overpressure blows the lid off the core, and the inrush of oxygen combines with hydrogen, superheated graphite, and the remains of the fuel rods to produce a titanic explosion which utterly destroys the reactor and most of the surrounding building, scattering chunks of graphite and fuel rod around the immediate vicinity. As the court digests the full truth of what happened, Legasov reiterates that for as reckless as Dyatlov's actions were, he would probably never have undertaken them had he known of the flaw in the AZ-5 system. The judge reminds Legasov that this contradicts what he said in Vienna, to which Legasov admits frankly that his testimony was a lie, and indeed that the entire disaster was the result of secrecy and lies, born out of a desire to avoid the Soviet Union's nuclear technologies being seen as anything other than the best in the world, even if it comes at the cost of people's lives. He concludes his testimony by saying that is how an RBMK reactor core explodes. Lies. Legasov is immediately taken from the courtroom to a bathroom, where he's eventually confronted by the enraged Charkov. Charkov then admits that they can't actually punish Legasov in any real way, as his appearance in Vienna would lead to too many questions if he suddenly disappeared. Instead, his testimony at the trial will be disavowed and kept secret. He will hold his job in name only and not be permitted any actual duties, and the history books will be rewritten to give credit for his accomplishments to other people. As he's led away to begin his life of isolation and ignominy, Legasov shares one last look with Sherbina and Komyuk, knowing that they at least tried to do the right thing and hoping that it will somehow, someday, pay off.
To be a scientist is to be naive. We are so focused on our search for truth, we fail to consider how few actually want us to find it. But it is always there, whether we see it or not, whether we choose to or not. The truth doesn't care about our needs or wants. It doesn't care about our governments, our ideologies, our religions. It will lie in wait for all time. And this, at last, is the gift of Chernobyl. Where I once would fear the cost of truth, now I only ask, what is the cost of lies?
Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers by hitting on that subscribe button. Thank you for watching.